Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Josh Heumann. I have the great fortune of serving as Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery. Located at Harborfront Center, just a few blocks south of here, the Power Plant presents contemporary art by Canadian and international artists, typically emerging artists or mid-career artists who have not yet had solo exhibitions in Toronto or Canada. In late September, our fall 2017 exhibitions opened, including Ears to Speak Of, featuring sculpture by Amalia Pica, and Urban Now, City Life in Congo, featuring photography and film and video work by Sami Balogi and Philippe Deboc. Both are on view through December 31st. Additionally, we kicked off a site-specific commission called Demonstration by Michael Landy, which will continue to grow thanks to an open call for submissions until May 13th of 2018. Each season, to complement our exhibitions, we offer numerous education and public programs, some of them off-site, like this series of Power Talks. We're also participating downstairs at Edition Toronto, the second annual art book fair, so if you have time after this, please consider taking a peek at our table, where you'll find select publications, limited edition artworks, and more. We're pleased to present a series of 3 Power Talks during Art Toronto for the 11th year, and we extend our thanks to Susanna Rosenstock and her team for inviting us. On Friday, we heard from LA-based artist Charles Gaines, speaking about minimizing subjectivity by eliminating his imagination, by devising systems that create artworks. And yesterday, we heard from Mary Spirito, founding director of Proto Cinema, based in Istanbul and New York City. She spoke about select curatorial projects and her vision for the new role of nonprofits worldwide. Today's Power Talk is the last of this year's series, and we are featuring Courtney J Martin, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Dia Art Foundation. Prior to Dia, she was an assistant professor in the History of Art and Architecture department at Brown University, with previous positions at Vanderbilt, University of California, Berkeley, Getty Research Institute, Henry Moore Institute, and the Ford Foundation. In 2015, she received an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. Martin received a doctorate from Yale University for her research on 20th century British art, and has written essays on Kader Attia, Rina Banerjee, Frank Bowling, Leslie Hewitt, Asghar Yorn, Ed Ruscha, and Yinka Shonabare. She has curated a number of notable exhibits, including Drop, Roll, Slide, Drip, Frank Bowling's Poured Paintings, 1973 to 1978 at Tate Britain in 2012, Minimal Baroque, Post-Minimalism and Contemporary Art at Rone Beckshom in Denmark in 2014, and Robert Ryman at the Dia Art Foundation in 2015, which is the springboard for today's talk. So please join me in welcoming Courtney J Martin.
Hi. It is a great pleasure to be in Toronto today. I'd like to thank the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery for inviting me to speak, specifically the director Gaetan Verna, Joshua Heumann, and education fellow Timothy Chandler. It's always nice to be up north. This is an image of Ryman working in his studio on Greenwich Street in New York, just to give you a sense of the person that we'll be talking about today. When I began thinking about how the Ryman exhibition for Dia Chelsea might take place, I returned to my notes on and memories of other exhibitions of his paintings, to think through what I knew about his practice and what I might add to this vast exhibition history. One of my first realizations was that this important American painter had only rarely been shown singly in American museums. This show would be the first institutional presentation of his paintings since the 1993 Museum of Modern Art retrospective. Curated by Robert Storr, this show was the most comprehensive retrospective of the artist's work ever held in the United States to the present. It comprised almost 80 works, dating from 1955 to those that had come straight from the artist's studio. Due to Ryman's renown in Europe, many of the works had not been seen in many years, or if ever, in the States. After closing in 1994, the show would travel for a few years to the then Tate Gallery in London, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, before concluding at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. Central to this exhibition was the recovery of paintings that had reframed the ways in which Ryman was viewed by the public. For many, Ryman painted small, all-white squares. But Storr brought out a different story. He taught us that color, technique, and scale could be used to dissuade this limited view of Ryman. Perhaps the most notable inclusion was the orange painting. Likely, this painting was his earliest painting completed, and it is definitely one of the first to be shown in New York. It also represents a transition for Ryman. It is the end of his career as a jazz saxophonist and the beginning of his career as a painter. The 1993 retrospective also included a small painting that deeply impacted the artist's ability to make that leap into art making. Titled To Gertrude Mellon, the painting was purchased by Mrs. Mellon from the staff exhibition at MoMA in 1958. There, at MoMA, Ryman had worked as a guard during the day and painted at night. The staff show was his first group exhibition, and the sale of the work his first as well. In viewing this painting, I imagined that its diminutive size belies its deep import as a crucial incentive to keep painting, to continue painting when he could have been playing music, to continue showing his early work when he could have just maintained his job as a guard at MoMA. I knew that I needed to highlight color in my show, and I also knew that I needed to show that color was always ever present in his earliest works, even if we only discuss the achromatic surfaces. By the way, achroma is the term that Ryman likes or prefers instead of white. So when I say achroma, you can think white. For these reasons, it is important to include this painting in my show. I wanted people to know what early Ryman was thinking about, what he was making, and how he was making it. Moreover, I wanted artists of all stages to have a subtle reminder of how often success can be measured in small steps. It is for these reasons that I hung it next to a large painting from the 1980s, so that all might see scale as something that can be fine-tuned for effect. From the 1993 show, I turned to a show that I had never seen, the 1972 Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum exhibition. Curated by Diane Waldman, this show was the artist's first solo exhibition in a New York museum. There, they presented 38 of his paintings dating from 1965 to 1972. I point out these dates because I think it's important to know that even though audiences were able then to see the work, they still didn't see the early work. So they didn't know about the orange painting. They did not know about any of the other color studies that had taken place in the 1950s. They are essentially seeing only achromatic surfaces. Crucial to this show, the Guggenheim show, was the inclusion of large-scale works that showed not only Ryman's ability to inhabit space, but also his ability to use materials not known for their volume or for their mass. Classico 4, seen here, is one of a series of compositions consisting of multi-panel paintings on a specific brand of paper, Classico. For each work in the series, Ryman attached a configuration of heavy, creamy white sheets of the paper to a wall with masking tape. He then painted the sheets with a shiny acrylic paint. He then removed the tape after painting, and when the sheets were dry, mounted them on foam core and then reattached them to the wall on a grid. The Classico series differs in the organization of paper sheets, the number of panels, the configuration of tape traces, and the painted shape. Yet, each of the works in this series share an emphasis on the thinness of the support surface in its alignment with the wall and the monumentality that it conceives of as an accumulation of parts. For the Dia presentation, I located another Classico, Classico 6, a work from 1968 that demonstrated Ryman's interest in working larger, demarcating space, and in manipulating the soft property of paper into a seemingly hard support. It is a compelling work, I think, made more so by its installation. It is now attached instead of straight to the wall. It is attached panel by panel using magnets in the painting and those that can be found on the other side of the wall, which one must then attach. In the back of my mind, of course, was Ryman's long-standing relationship with Dia. His first solo show at Dia was held at the former Dia Center for the Arts in 1988. Curated by Gary Garrels, the show inaugurated the Dia Collection's transition from being a public-private entity that only presented parts of its collection to being a museum that would arrange exhibitions of works with artists not in its collection. He was at the time, interestingly enough, not in the collection, but he was seen rather as someone who was so contemporary that he had to be shown. Strangely, he wasn't really considered to be one that was either conceptual or minimalist by the terms of then Dia's collecting mandate. That show, the 1988 show, led to Dia's first exhibition catalog and some of the same principles that Dia holds to the present, such as working directly with living artists as fully as possible. On the then remote 22nd Street between 10th and 11th Avenues, this was one of the first real exhibitions of art to be held in what we now know of as Chelsea. It sounds very mystical, but I do imagine a time that Chelsea was not Chelsea and that really did feel far away from the centers of the art world at the time on 57th Street and in Soho. To that end, when Dia moved from 22nd Street to the Hudson Valley in 2003, Ryman worked closely with staff to select, arrange, and to install his long-term installation at Dia Beacon. These rooms present Ryman's exacting vision for his works in this place at that moment. It is, to my mind, one of the best examples of why working with living artists is so fulfilling. In preparation for the show, I was excited to see so many more of his paintings, as much as I was challenged to think about organizing them in a manner that explained the aesthetic richness presented by Ryman, as well as his exhibition histories. The Dia Chelsea presentation would be the second Dia show to return to Chelsea following the opening of Dia Beacon, and it is directly across the street from the former Dia building on 22nd Street, the site of his first Dia show. It was a long history to work with, frankly. As such, I spoke with as many people as I could who had seen the 1988 show because this connection was important to me and I hope also to Bob. The second gallery, seen here, exactly replicates how I ingested the work over the course of that year. There were the works that demonstrated Ryman's understanding of the relationship between the painting and the wall by way of fasteners, hardware, and sure-handed determination. In other works, Ryman's sincere and long-term experimentation with the interaction of light and color on the canvas is front and center. These works were adjacent to others that demonstrate a material curiosity and willingness to experiment in the field of metals. Here, for example, is the wall that makes plain, to me at least, the profoundly frustrating and fulfilling conversations that many painters have with the edges of their canvases. The paintings that I selected for the north or back wall of the larger gallery combine some aspects of all of the best attributes of the other works. From the outset of organizing the show, I was struck by their formal complexity, cool surfaces, and multiple engagements with space. All were completed within a few years of each other in the 1980s and with a limited range of tools and materials. Yet they do not form a series or a named group, as so many others in his practice do. Dia's long commitment to minimalist art also means that any artist within the space of Dia now is also appointed to minimalism. But it's just not true for Ryman. He didn't follow this line, and he doesn't agree with the idea of his work being minimalist. Though he was familiar with these artists and with their work, he was a painter who saw himself as such, as a painter, despite the forms in which his canvases or lack of canvases might take. Taken together, or examined one by one, these works have led me to pose larger questions about the state of the three-dimensional objects in Ryman's overall painting practice. Despite the seeming two-dimensionality of most of his paintings, as early as the 1960s, curators, critics, and viewers were aware of the possibility of the object within his output. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the inclusion of Allied, seen here, in systemic painting, which was curator Lawrence Alloway's final exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. On view throughout the fall of 1966, the show featured 28 New York-based painters in an installation that encompassed almost the entirety of the museum. Ryman joined a list that included Ellsworth Kelly, Frank Stella, Ken Noland, and others. Though each artist took a different approach to their work, most worked in a large scale, utilized high-key color, and many employed various innovative methods such as shaped canvases or enameling. Conceptually, systemic embodied a loose, layman's interpretation of systems theory, an interdisciplinary study of order developed in the hard sciences. Notable to critics and viewers, however, was that the large number of paintings there were rendered in relief. Though the show lacked a conclusive explanation of the relationship between systems theory and painting practices, the prevalence of objects that lived between the painting and sculpture binary was a feature that defined the show and best illustrated something that might be called systemic. Within this curatorial concept and installed in the museum's demonstrative architecture, Allied could be seen for its potential toward dimensionality, though it remains a two-dimensional work. In fact, Alloway described this potential, the potential to move away from the canvas, to move off of the wall, as something called matter painting, a form that he placed halfway between painting and sculpture. This was not unlike Donald Judd's understanding of the specific object, save for the point of departure. Alloway, unlike Judd, started from the point of view of painting, whereas Judd came from sculpture. As objects, matter painting was decidedly abstract and devoted to occupying literal space, rather than creating an illusion of space. While this may not have been a true reflection of Allied's actual physical characteristics, its presence in the exhibition makes the most sense as a meditation on what space around a painting might add to the composition, just at the moment in which Ryman claimed literal space as a constituent of all of his compositions. As a side note, I was inspired by this image when I spoke to Diane Waldman, the curator of the 1972 Guggenheim retrospective. I asked her in that conversation when she first started thinking about doing a solo show with Ryman. And I point out, this is Waldman standing with her back to the viewer, that is Alloway, and these are the rest of the installers that are actually installing the works. The figuration that you see here, I think, actually spoke very well to the relationship they had. Alloway was the senior curator, but she was always alongside him in this process. When Alloway leaves the museum in 1966, Waldman steps into that position. It is from there that she can curate the Ryman show. Diane Waldman also told me that Ryman had stood out to her early in her career and that working on Systemic was not the first time that she had encountered him, but that she was very interested in the way in which Alloway placed him in the show. She thought that Alloway did not give him enough prominence. In the early 1970s, Ryman began experimenting with wooden supports. These experimentations were concurrent with others in metals and plastics that he undertook in the same decade. Perhaps it is the aftermath of the space race and the prevalence of new materials that the aeronautics and space industries released into the open market that supported his natural curiosity about ground. Or, as other writings suggest, the wooden support was simply a problem to be solved. Whatever the occasion or the prompt, Ryman began using pre-made wooden doors as supports. These structures are hollow, thinly constructed, and relatively lightweight. Varese Wall is one such structure. Installed in the first year that Dia Beacon opened in 2003, Varese Wall dates from 1975. By definition, a wall is a continuous vertical structure that defines an area. The scale of a wall often notates its purpose as one of enclosure, shelter, architecture, or direction, though any of these attributes could be combined for multiple purposes. Despite the suggestion of the title, Varese Wall is not a single structure, nor is it load-bearing, save for the multiple layers of paint that have been applied to it. The painting is actually made up of 6 wood door panels held together by 6 corresponding metal rods, the entirety of which is painted and sits over 5 blue foam blocks, often used for protecting objects from another surface, like a painting from resting on a studio floor. And I point out here, these are the blue foam blocks that you will find throughout this work. Each time the Varese Wall is installed, it must be fully repainted. Measuring 8 feet high and 24 feet long, it is objectively large. And for Ryman's practice, one of the largest works that he has completed to date. As you can see in the image, Varese does not rest on the wall. It is braced to stand just over 1.5 feet away from the wall. This relationship to that wall creates a kind of negative space of just enough width that can neither be transgressed by a human body nor completely ignored. Unfortunately, children at Dia do try to run between the wall and the object, but that's a different story. This space is, I think, as close as Ryman gets to an aggressive gesture or a directive. 1975, the year that Varese was completed, was an important one for Ryman. He had held a well-received solo show at the Kunsthalle in Basel, and he'd begun experimenting with the fasteners and fittings that would officially make their appearance in paintings in the following year. Here I show you one example of an early work in which fasteners are to be taken as part of the whole, rather than an added part. The presence of these fasteners indicates that we need to look around the work, to see the wall, to see the sides, front, top, and bottom, without the limitation of the edge of the canvas. Perhaps we might then look to Varese as a kind of prototype for these works because of its physical projection from the wall and the visible supports on both its back and bottom sides. These works' evocative title has a seemingly straightforward provenance. Varese was commissioned by Italian art patron Giuseppe Panza di Buomo for inclusion in his museum-scaled estate in Varese, Italy. In the interview with curator Gary Garrels that accompanied his 1988 exhibition at Dia, Ryman describes the sculptural feel of Varese as an incident of his process rather than its content. He intended, as he explained to Garrels, to make a room in Panza's villa that it could allow for the changeable conditions of the northwestern Lombardy region that resulted in the villa's damp walls. He continued with the following, quote, "I was trying to devise a way to line the walls with metal foil because I wanted to paint on wooden veneer panels. I was working on a way to join them together so that they could line the room on 3 sides. Behind them would be the metal foil to keep the moisture away from the wood," end quote. His practical solution to the very real problem presented by the space was met by a desire to see the piece away from the wall, to see it sit on the floor, to be able to see its surface, front and back. He wanted it to be, quote, "totally naked." This phrase, "totally naked," is one that I think invites the transparency of the painting's relationship to the space that it inhabits. Here, we might substitute the word naked for literal, or more appropriately, anti-illusionistic. In this and in other interviews, Ryman has recounted viewing Panza's estate and its surrounding area, where he perhaps encountered the high walls that lined both sides of the hilly road leading away from the city of Varese up to the Villa Panza. Stay with me. Varese, of course, is the site of the Sacro Monte di Varese, the sacred mountain of Varese, the well-worn mountaintop pilgrimage site that charts the mystery of Christ's life. The holy road that leads up to the site is also lined on both sides by a wall. I point out this occurrence not to suggest a one-to-one match of the Varese walls' extended surface based on either account, the Panza collection site or the sacred site, or the sort of sense of location. This is not necessarily an Italian work in that sense. Rather, I use these examples to point to what I think is at stake at constituting a painting as an immovable object. How might we encounter this work not as sculpture or as architecture, but as material permanence? How might we construe the significant material renewal required to destabilize that permanence? Though I've situated this idea within the context of the three-dimensional, I'm now challenged to pay attention to the properties of fixity, duration, and stability as functions of painting. Lucio Fontana's concept of spatialismo, might be useful in this process. First promoted in his Manifesto Blanco of 1946, spatialism was his attempt as a painter to transcend the confines of the two-dimensional plane. In his first manifesto, Fontana announced his goal for a spatialist art, one that would engage technology to achieve an expansion of the fourth dimension and a radical new aesthetic idiom. This idiom, of course, would meld the categories of architecture, sculpture, and painting. Fontana's concept might be a constructive way to consider how Varese functions as an architectonic painting, all the while maintaining its medium specificity. The scale, the active reapplication of paint required to install, and the place name title suggest that Ryman's commission for Panza might have been intended as a site-specific work and/or long-term display for the villa. There are others of this sort that remain on site by his contemporaries, Robert Irwin, James Turrell, or Dan Flavin, whose permanent installation at the Villa Panza I show you here. All of these works were also acquired and installed between 1973 and 1976, just like Varese. But Varese was constructed in Ryman's studio in New York, where it was propped up by the blue foam as he worked on it. The studio adjustment, the blue foam, gave him an idea of how he might further display this work. Though commissioned for Panza, it never went to the villa. When it was shown at the John Weber Gallery in November of 1975, Ryman retained the foam blocks partly because they had, through the course of its production, become inseparable from any other aspect of the composition. It would be like taking the painting away from the wall. In Ryman's words, quote, "I became so used to these foam blocks that they became a part of the painting. I just couldn't see it any other way," end quote. Within their compositional function, there was also practicality. In the same passage, he notes that the floor of the Weber Gallery space at 420 West Broadway was uneven. So the foam blocks doubled back on their original function as a way to stabilize the large work. I show you here this larger, earlier image of Weber's gallery so that you have a sense of what that floor looked like. What Ryman did not say in his critique of the floor was that Weber's gallery was one of the few in Soho in which his large yet ultimately pristine work could be shown. Other Soho galleries were either too small or far less finished than Weber's. They would have lacked the real depth to show the work. They would not have had adequate spaces between the real walls and the work to be able to see the difference between the two. And further, there would be no distance for the viewers to enter the space, back away from the wall, and actually understand it as an object. In addition to serving as a kind of beta model for the later works with fasteners, the Varese wall is also an antecedent for the group of three-dimensional paintings that Ryman completed in the 1980s. Without name or designation as a series, these paintings have a specific place within his practice. In the early 1980s, Ryman began working with Josh Bugeyer, a stretcher maker and fabricator in Brooklyn who had previously made other stretchers and supports. Did you have a question? I can't hear you. Yes, definitely, absolutely. I would say that I've probably got, 11 minutes left. Would that work? With Bugeyer, he developed an aluminum or fiberglass honeycomb lattice structure that would form the interiors of the support. Paint could then be applied to them. This structure was both a replacement for and improvement upon the thin, hollow panels used for the Varese wall. Here, I show you an example of, but not the exact one, the studio won't let me, unfortunately, of what these honeycombed interiors look like next to an example of the type of hollow panel used in Varese wall. So this is what the hollow panel looked like. These are the substitutes. Imagine something in between those two. Lightweight and more resilient and durable, these new supports could be formed in ways that matched Ryman's thinking about surface and ground. But they did not need to be repainted each time they were shown, nor did they completely require the metal rods for stability. To my knowledge, there are only 7 of these paintings, and of those 7, only 3 are at a substantial relief to be described as fully three-dimensional. These are pace, factor, and pair navigation, seen here. The three-dimensional paintings were first shown from February to March of 1984 at the New York outpost of what was then Gallery Mate Lalonde, now the Lalonde Gallery. This space was a temporary office on 57th Street that was used before the new gallery would open on 9 West 57th. Both were established as a way to serve or mine the French gallery's American artists such as Edward Kienholz, Jim Dine, and Ryman. This exhibition of 3 works was a kind of preview for the larger show in Paris that opened later in the spring of 1984 and featured all 7 from the group. In the New York display, factor and pace dominated the small area, giving way to a sense that these works were overtly monumental, a physical departure from the Ryman known for his smaller, painterly white squares. The fabricated works were a result of his investigations into the decade prior, into radical modes of painting and presentation. Take pace. The painting is a small square placed horizontally. From this position, its face, as it were, is positioned for the viewer to look onto it from above. But from a slight distance, the narrow band of redwood indicates the edge of the canvas, suggesting that this painting is actually on a solid wooden panel. But that's not the case. Instead, it is a fiberglass construction painted over a reflective white enamel. The small wall fasteners hold the work in place, while the long, thin aluminum legs make a show of the verticality of the painting. It would be very easy to describe this work as sculpture, and perhaps even easier to categorize it as minimalist. It's fabricated, composed of new materials, and streamlined in a manner that supports a general understanding of that period, minimalism, those artists and their objects. But pace, factor, and pair navigation beside it were conceived, composed, and displayed in the 1980s. Well after the origins of minimalism would have allowed them to exist without acknowledging its discourse. Let me be clear. I do not think that Ryman is trying to make minimal objects, nor do I think that he was trying to periodize his output, i.e., make himself a minimalist for the market. Rather, I think that he knew full well what those criticisms would be, and he waited for them to happen in an effort to show that, no, once again, these are paintings. Why else would someone so sure of his materials and their functions make objects that obscured their own construction? Why else would he knowingly place those objects at heights that allude to a familiar strain of domesticity, if not also design? Why play with late modernism if you already know how the game will end? While I do not have the big answers to these big questions, I'm certain that what is happening with each of these works is strategic. There is a way in which one cannot look at them and not take seriously the innovation of contemporary painting. These works force us to look above and below while looking from above, below, and around. They demand a viewership that is engaged, somewhere between spectator and participant. In each, the canvas has become a plane that is a total field. I'm borrowing the concept of field from Pierre Bourdieu's use of the term field, wherein a field, like art, is constituted by the set of ever-shifting conditions that determine its corpus at any one time. In Ryman's three-dimensional paintings, our field starts with the painted plane and extends out into the rest of his practice to see the painting as a realm of potential meaning that cannot be reduced into parts. This year, my show, the Dia Chelsea Show, traveled to the Humex Museum in Mexico City, making this Ryman's first show in Latin America. My insistence on space, depth, and distance, both in that show in both of its iterations and now, has served as a way for me to comprehend how these works fit inside of his whole practice, but also how they might fit one-to-one next to other paintings from their time and after. I hope that these concepts help viewers do the same thing. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much to Courtney J Martin for her talk. We do have a microphone for questions, so I'll just hand it over.
So this is the first time I've been introduced to Ryman. I can't say I appreciate his work. I feel as if I don't really know why it's considered art.
You're not the only one.
And I don't understand when you say he's been working on this, and he worked on this in a different way. What kind of work is he doing? Like, are these painted, or what kind of work is he doing to, I don't mean installation work. I mean, what kind of work is he doing on the canvases?
When I say work, I mean two things. So when I say work, I can either mean that this is another way to call something an object. So I might say there are works of art out in this space, or I might have said that these were paintings. It's a way to give you a different word so I don't just keep saying painting, 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 painting over and over again. It's a synonym. The other way that I use work, though, is to describe process, right? So he is actually a painter. He is one who puts paint onto canvas, but he also puts paint onto board, he puts paint onto aluminum, copper, sometimes a straight wall, sometimes a floor. You know, paint can go lots of places. There are also works that he calls paintings that aren't actually painted, if that makes sense. So there are enamels, for example, and there are copper works that were not painted at all. Does that make sense?
I'm not even sure what to ask. So, are there other minimalists who are doing work that has some color in it?
Ryman has lots of color. Let's
I
go back.
don't see any color.
Oh, there's a lot of color. Let's go back and find some color here.
I see the edge, which is the redwood.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, that's another minimalist who works with color, Dan Flavin. Let's see here. All of those works had color, but unfortunately they didn't have color photography in '66 at the Guggenheim, so unfortunately we can't see those colors in those images. Not exactly my fault, nor the Guggenheim's. We blame technology. There's some color, they're small.
That was the only place that I saw the color.
It's
yes.
coming, I promise you. There we go. Color. And even more color.
The orange and that one small painting, yeah.
I'm showing you a small selection of works from a practice that dates back to the mid-50s. There are overwhelmingly achromatic surfaces, but I think the other thing that might not be seen here, and one that I frankly, as you point out, in the time given, don't have enough time to explore with you, is that all of the surfaces have underpainting to them. They are all completely underpainted for those that are on canvas straights. So there is often a lot of color underneath, and so what we see as white is actually just the way in which our eyes, the light in the space, and whatever is underneath is reacting for us to visualize those as white. Some whites are darker, some whites are lighter.
Great. Another question?
So I'm just going to ask about how influential architecture and the space influenced his work, and especially in the Dia, how those spaces actually spoke to the minimalism and the depth of what he was looking at.
I think actually that those spaces at Dia were very influential, and I'll tell you why in a way that seems unconnected, but when you think of it all together, it's very connected. So that light bulb that you see there is a light bulb taken from what was the former Dia Center for the Arts across the street on 22nd Street. While Ryman didn't choose those light bulbs to show, he was part of a selection group because he is the first real show to okay those lights' use, right? So there's a way in which he wants to set a stage for how his work will be seen. What this shot also doesn't tell you is, and I'm not sure why it looks like it's on, because in fact it's off. Our show was in natural light fully when possible. So at the very beginning of the show in December of 15, we had natural light for about 4 to 5 hours every day. By the end of the show, the lights stayed off the entire time. We only turned them on when it was dark outside or if people complained. And usually we would wait a few minutes when people complained. Because it looks better in natural light, it really does. So that doesn't answer fully your architecture question, but I do think that he is thinking about it. The other thing that's kind of interesting as a side note, but related, Ryman's studio was designed by an architect called Richard Gluckman, who also was one of the first designers to work on the Dia spaces. Those things happen at exactly the same time. So if he didn't like what Dia was doing as a space, it seems hard for me to believe that he would choose the same architect to then redesign his studio. It feels quite close as a parallel. So clearly, architecture is there in many ways.
Thank you very much for your time. I found this super enlightening, and I learned a lot. I've been to Dia Bacon. I love it. It's fantastic.
Come back.
Space. I will. So my question is, from a curator standpoint, I understand the achromatic sort of aspect that he portrays in his work. How did you find, like, what struggles did you go through when curating this and highlighting each of the pieces? Because I know, like, the space and just the shape and stuff. Like, how do you find, from your perspective, trying to get his message out in the artwork? Because I found it really, really spatially intricate. Yeah.
It is. It is in many ways. I think, so first of all, I'm completely convinced of the work, and so I don't need to convince myself first. Where there are other things that I had to learn about or come to or know more around those objects before I could get there. I learned about Ryman when I was a child, and in many ways, later understandings of more experimental art in the 60s and 70s, I understood because first I understood Ryman, and he made sense to me. So coming to Flavin, for example, was made easier by already knowing Ryman. I could understand why someone would want to work with artificial light because I had already known someone's work who wanted to work with natural light. I could see those differences. One of the reasons that I wanted to show color in the first room of the exhibition, and what you're seeing here is actually the first room of the exhibition, but it's the north side of the first room of a room that runs south to north, is me trying to show you everything that I think you already think and debunk it. The works are not all small white squares. The works can be large. Sometimes they involve a lot of hardware. Sometimes they're not actually painting at all. There is paper. There are works. This paper right here is actually like a wrapping paper, like the underside of a wrapping paper. And this is a work from the 1950s. And so even in the 50s, he's already ready to give up what would have been thought of as traditional painting. I hope that people could see that. I know that lots of people came to that show and felt like it looked different than what they expected. I liked that. I was glad that people came in one way and came out the other way. The other issue for me, and the reason that I am so attached to those three-dimensional objects, is Ryman's insistence that they are paintings. To my mind, they are many, many things, but I don't know that painting is the first thing that I think when I get to one of these objects. And so I then need to understand why they were paintings. And once I understood, I tried to then explain to other people why they are paintings. You don't have to agree with them, but I like the idea that he set out a kind of form and that we can either take one view with it and go with him, or we can diverge. And I think that's okay. Yeah.
Hello? Specifically these 3D, I can see that they're attached to the wall. Are they attached to the bottom, or are they just balanced on the
Balanced.
bottom? And then what about those clips? Are they custom-made clips, or are they off-the-rack clips?
Both. They were once off the rack, and then off the rack changed. All the local hardware stores that used to sell this kind of material in New York have been replaced by the big conglomerates. And in many of those, little bits, pieces, nails, the little things that one needed to actually make this work. Some of them don't exist anymore, and they now have to be either made or found better as a substitute. So they really were once commonplace things. When you look at early studio pictures, one of my favorite things about the work is when you get to see the laundry list of what was in the studio, and you can imagine that many of those things went into the paintings. Elmer's glue, masking tape, regular paper, blue paper towels, all kinds of things that we think of as being quite commonplace and not rarefied as fine art tools in any way are there, and some of those things end up in the work. One of the reasons I think that I pointed out that when he moves from Varese-Wall in the 70s to these works in the 1980s and has he's figured out how to hide the sort of supports a little bit better, is that now what we see as support is not necessarily supportive. So in the case of this work here, paranavigation, it's the unseen thing that's holding paranavigation up, whereas the legs that you see here, they are part of the painting, but they are not actually structural. They're not needed. No.
Great. Do we have one last question, perhaps? Excellent.
Dr. Propicow.
Thank you for that terrific talk. So how does his work of this period fit into larger explorations of assemblage? I think about Rauschenberg and his combines and mounting as a sort of concern of his, which was integral to the overall presentation of the object. Is Ryman participating in that as well?
I think a bit. I think that's there, and I think I'm glad that you are bringing that up, because I don't think that Rauschenberg is someone that you often put into the same sentence with Ryman, because you often see, excess on the one hand and reduction on the other hand, right? But assemblage, I think, is a really good term, because we also rarely talk about minimalist, abstract, or reduced art types in any way as being assembled. We might talk about them being fabricated, whereas conversely, we would never talk about a Johns or a Rauschenberg as in any way being fabricated, even if they do have parts that are found and then put together by someone else. So there's a way in which I think he's playing with all of that, and then on top of that, there is the resistance to calling them anything that would be referred to as multi-dimensioned. These are paintings. Just like all of the other ones are paintings, there's no way outside of that, which forces us to come sort of through that conversation back into his language to use it. I too have questions around assembly, and I have to say, I am someone who's very interested in sculpture, and find it fascinating because you can move all the way around it. And so the fact that almost none of the Ryman objects that are in any way three-dimensional can actually be traversed on all sides makes it, I am compelled, I'm irritated, I'm annoyed, I'm gratified by it, I can stick my head around them, and I still want more, which is what keeps bringing me back to them, in a way. Are they finished on the backside? Is that the question? Some are, some aren't. There is no real sort of backside to this one because it's aluminum. This work is really not what you'd call finished on the other side, but if you flipped it over, what you would see is you would see the underside of the honeycomb thing that I showed you earlier. This one is finished on its backside. Varese-Wall, the one from 76, is not, and you can in fact see all of the supports, holes, and parts kind of poking out. It's like, the back of a robot, if one were to see robots.
Well, great. Well, the Power Plant and Art Toronto, thank you so much for coming.